All right, here we are for another biology video. As you can see, this one's about chromosomes, about cells, and we need to know about chromosomes and cells if we are going to continue talking about genetics, right? We started the genetics unit before the end of the first semester, and we just spent about a week doing biotechnology, which is kind of related to genetics. But now we're going to get into what most people consider to be traditional genetics, but we can't talk about genetics unless we know why the events of genetics happen. So that's what we're going to talk about, the foundations of genetics. Now, to remind us where we were at, this is the big question, the big idea. Why are you the way you are? Or to be a little bit less personal, where do traits come from for any organisms? How do traits manifest? How do you get them? Where do they come from, right? And so we've already started answering this question. You should have some answers to this now. And we know that it has a lot to do with DNA and genes and proteins, right? And that's what we spent the last part of the first semester talking about, how DNA and genes make proteins and how proteins create traits. But there is another way to answer this question about where do traits come from. And a lot of people said that they come from your parents or even your ancestors, which is a weird thing to say. And we'll talk about why ancestors do belong in this conversation. So, genetics really encompasses both of these things. One thing that genetics wants to do is to try to predict the traits of future offspring. So if these two parents are going to have an offspring, what might the offspring look like? What traits might they have? What diseases might they have? Hopefully none. So we want to predict the traits of future offspring, or if we already have some offspring that have a certain trait, we want to try to explain why that individual has the traits they have. Where did those traits come from? Now, both of these have to do with some of these science ideas that I introduced way back in the beginning of the year. But in particular, patterns are going to be huge in this unit, right? In order to predict things, you have to observe the way that events have been happening and notice a pattern to then use the pattern to predict what's going to happen in the future. And to just spoil it a little bit, this is where Punnett squares come in about doing probability to predict what might happen with future offspring. Or again, what if we have an individual that already has a trait and we want to know where it came from? This would be looking at patterns of inheritance, patterns of your family history, something called a pedigree or a family tree that would fit in the patterns. Then there is another science idea here called cause and effect that is a huge part of it, right? The cause of all of your traits are your genes. Your traits are the effect of the proteins that are created from genes, right? So cause and effect is going to come up a whole lot. What happens if these traits are, or these genes are passed? That will cause other traits to develop, right? And so just keep your eye out for that, and I'll keep mentioning patterns and cause and effect throughout the unit. Now, let's start with explaining the traits of current offspring. Yesterday, you took some genetics probes, which a probe is just some questions to get you to talk about things so that I can see where you are at and what you're thinking about genetics. And one of them had to do with these two girls. They are from the UK. They kind of got viral a little while ago. I don't know how long time is meaningless now, but a while ago, they were in the news because they were featured in a newspaper article in the UK, and then that started spreading everywhere because people were having a hard time believing that these two girls were actually not just sisters, but actually twins. Like they were literally born on the same day from the same mom, very closely together, right? Must one of them be adopted? Right now, part to answer this question, you have to know a little bit about twins, and that might have influenced your answer on this. But it's important to note that these are not identical twins. Obviously, they're not identical, right? But identical twins and non-identical twins. Non-identical twins are called fraternal twins, as you can see down here at the bottom. They have two different mechanisms for how they happen. Identical twins happen when one egg and one sperm meet to fertilize to make one cell called a zygote, the first cell. But then as that zygote starts to grow into a little ball of cells called an embryo, and then the embryo would grow into a whole full-fledged organism, the embryo splits We don't know exactly why, but something random happens and the ball of cells splits into two balls of cells. But what you get are two babies that are inside the same placenta. Basically, they were supposed to be one baby, but it turned into two, right? And so identical twins happen from one egg and one sperm. But non identical twins are basically like having two babies from two separate pregnancies just happen to happen at the same time. Notice they're in separate placentas, separate containers, separate packaging, right? So this is in fact two different pregnancies. And so you have to treat these kinds of twins as two different pregnancies. They are not all from one event. And so that might influence the way that you would think about this. Now, most of you said that this is possible. Maybe you already heard about the story before. But when you would say, well, of course this is possible, somebody who was not convinced would say, well, you have to explain it, right? Like, how could that be possible? And the biggest thing that people said in their responses is this: it depends upon their parents, right? Who are their parents? What do their parents look like? If you get your traits from your parents, then we have to know about their parents to explain how they got their traits. So let's look at their parents' DNA, parental DNA. Now, of course, I don't have actually literally a picture of the parents of those two girls' DNA, right? Like, you don't just go and look up people's DNA. So these are generic pictures. But on the left here, you have what's called a karyotype, something that we will get back to. Oh, there we go, karyotype. It's just a picture of all the chromosomes inside of a cell, and this would represent the father's genome, the entirety of all their DNA. Here would be a picture of a generic mother's genome, a karyotype for a female, right? And so before we get any further, we got to remember what these things called chromosomes are, right? And so just to remind us, a chromosome is a long piece of DNA, right? We have our double helix, that is this spiral staircase type of situation. And then that gets twisted and twisted and twisted up really tightly to make a chromosome, right? So a chromosome is a long piece of DNA. And then a gene is just one little section out of that long piece of DNA. Now, real quick, in this picture, I want to point out that this right here looks like a butterfly kind of orientation for the chromosome. And chromosomes do look like that sometimes, but only in certain situations, which we aren't ready to talk about yet. Most of the time, inside of your body, the chromosomes are just these long sticks, if you want to think of them, long spaghetti noodles. This one has two sides to it because it has been copied. It's going to go through something called meiosis or mitosis. Again, we're not ready for that yet. But just to remind you that when we look at these pictures of people's chromosomes, they just look like these little sticks, but the sticks are made up of double helixes that each double helix has many, many, many types of genes on it. And so, again, here we are with these karyotypes, with these pictures of the chromosomes. So let's take a look at these. I don't know where the good place to put my face is. Something like that, maybe. Because here is going to be a question. What can you tell about the human genome from looking at these karyotypes? What are some true statements that you can make that are going to help us to understand the way that chromosomes work during sexual reproduction, during the creation of offspring, right? There are many things you can say. Again, if you don't know exactly what to say, just start saying things that are true, like look at the pictures and make observations. Now, again, I don't know exactly what you said, but there's a few things that hopefully you did say. One of the first things to notice is that while the karyotypes are different a little bit for the mother and the father, they both have 46 total chromosomes, right? You would maybe have to count these, but there are 23 pairs. And then so that gives you the second thing that is important, is that they come in pairs. There are two number ones and two number twos and two number threes, two number fours, two number fives, and all the way down to number 23. Although notice there isn't a number 23 listed on the pictures. The 23rd pair is an interesting one. You might have noticed that the males, their 23rd pair isn't really a pair. It's two different chromosomes, right? This one is very long, and this one's very short. Meanwhile, the female chromosome has two of the same. They do have an actual pair, and those pairs are called X chromosomes. We'll get back to X and Y chromosomes. The Y chromosome's the little one right there. We'll get back to those later. A couple other things you might have noticed is that they're numbered by size, that the longest one is chromosome number 1 and the shortest one is chromosome number 22. Again, the 23rd pair is called the sex chromosome, and they don't really, we have to treat them differently. And we'll learn about why and how we treat them differently later. Right? So we need to know some things about DNA. The human genome for humans, in your body cells, your average everyday cells, there is a word for these called somatic cells, as you can see. Somatic is a word that I'm not going to use a whole lot, but it will come up. You might read it in articles or on questions and things. Somatic means body. Average everyday cells. This is a picture of a liver cell. These are muscle cells. These are brain cells. All of these cells are different, but they all have the same 46 chromosomes. In your body, every single cell has the same DNA. They come in pairs, 23 pairs, and there is a word for this that you need to know. And there it is on the screen. It's called diploid. Di means two, right? The prefix di means two. So diploid means two. It might be written in this way sometimes, 2N. N means the one set of chromosomes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way through 23. But you have two sets, so you have 2N. Chromosomes come in pairs, right? One other vocabulary word that I want to introduce now, just because it's going to show up a lot as we go further, is this, that these pairs are almost identical. Notice identical is in quotation marks right there. But there's a word for this called homologous. And remember, the prefix homo means same. So the two number ones are basically the same. They are different from chromosome number 2. They're the same in that they carry the same information. So on chromosome number 1, you have the same genes. No matter which copy you're looking at, there's always the same information, although the information isn't exactly identical. Right? So these are your regular average everyday cells. Now, what does this have to do with creating babies? Well, there's a problem with these cells. Oh, I got ahead of myself. There is a problem with the cells, but I wanted to make one quick point here. This is just as you can see, a table that has a list of different chromosome numbers, the diploid number for lots of different species. Sometimes students think that 46 is an important number, and it is, but only to humans. Every human must have 46 chromosomes. We will see as we go along that having even one extra or missing one is likely going to lead to huge problems. Problems which a lot of times won't even lead to the baby being born, because the problems are so bad that the developing embryo wouldn't work properly because the chromosome number is wrong. But again, 46 is how many humans should have. But 46 isn't the right number, right? There's no right number. You can see there's a huge variety of different chromosome numbers. Chimps, our closest relative, has 2 more chromosomes than we do, right? Like sometimes people think, oh, well, chimps are lower down on the evolutionary ladder, which isn't true, but that's the way people think of it. And they think, well, they probably have less chromosomes because they're not quite as complicated. But in fact, they have more chromosomes. Your dog has 78 chromosomes, right? Technically, your dog has more DNA than you do. Mosquitoes have 6, and maybe you think, well, that makes sense because they're insects and they're simple. But look at this fern over here. A fern is a type of plant that holds the world record for most numbers of chromosomes at 1,440. So again, the total number of chromosomes, the number itself doesn't mean anything when in relation to other organisms. It does mean something important to each species, right? Every horse should have 64 chromosomes. If you're a horse without 64 chromosomes, you're probably not a horse, or you're a horse with a lot of problems, right? So just keep that in mind. You do need to remember that humans have 46 chromosomes, but don't think that that number is special other than it's just a normal one for our species. So why do they come in pairs? It has to do with sexual reproduction. It has to do with that diploid idea. And this is what I was getting ahead of myself on, that if you are going to reproduce with these normal diploid cells. Notice these circles that represent the cells on my screen. They say 2N, right? So it's trying to show you that there's 2 of everything in those cells, right? If you were to use those cells to reproduce, you would take your diploid cell and combine it with your partner's diploid cell. You wouldn't get another diploid cell, right? 2N plus 2N makes 4N. So the baby of that couple would have 4 copies of every chromosome, which is not supposed to happen. Then theoretically, if that 4 chromosomed baby could find somebody else to reproduce with that also had 4 chromosomes, then their babies would have 8 chromosomes, right? And so if you kept using your normal somatic average everyday diploid cells to reproduce with, you would have a lot of problems from one generation to the next, right? And so here's a little illustration just to show you, again, the same idea that the 2 parents that have 46 chromosomes have a kid with 92 chromosomes. And then that kid grows up to have 92 chromosomes, and their kid would have 184 chromosomes, right? And that's a problem. Maybe even more problematic is why this kid grows up to look exactly like his dad and marry a lady that looks exactly like his mom and have a kid that looks exactly like them. So this whole family has a whole lot of problems other than their diploid number. But if we want to reproduce, successfully, we need to cut it in half first. Then we can combine 2 halves. And again, like this is basically the simplest way to explain sexual reproduction. You have 2 cells that you combine. Each cell needs to have half of the total. And so we need things called gametes, egg cells, the largest of all human cells, and sperm cells, the smallest of all human cells, right? These each carry 1/2 of the total chromosomes of the individual, of the parent, right? Notice there's a word for this, and here's another word. So we've already learned diploid. This one is called haploid. Now, di means 2, and that's the way I remember it. Hap or ha, I don't know what the prefix HA means, but in my mind, when I say haploid, it sounds like the word halfloid, right? So haploid, maybe you'll remember it, that haploid cells have half of everything that they're supposed to have. They're supposed to have 2, so these only have 1. So here again is a picture of 1 set of human chromosomes. Everybody has 2 sets in their body, but 1 set consists of chromosomes 1 through 23, right? So if you take 2 of these cells that each have 23 chromosomes, you end up with 46 chromosomes like you should have, right? And so that's why why most species have an even number, why most of their chromosomes come in pairs. You would be hard pressed to find any organisms that don't have 2 copies of everything, because sexual reproduction leads to 2 copies of everything. Now, just to reinforce everything and to put it in writing, the most important idea of genetics is this, that you have 46 total chromosomes, but you can only give 23. Now, it isn't just any old 23, right? Like you have to give 1 of every pair. So even though you start with 2, you can only give 1 of each pair. And which one you give is random. You don't know which one is going to end up in your egg or your sperm. Now, there is a lot of science behind this, and hopefully we'll get a time to talk about it a little bit, about how you actually create the eggs or sperm. But the idea, of course, is over here, you have 2 number 1s, and you have to give 1 of them to your kid. Not both. It has to be 1. You can't not give 1, right? But is it going to be the one on the left, or is it going to be the one on the right? I don't know which one it's going to be. You don't know which one it's going to be. Your cells don't know which one it's going to be. It's going to be chosen randomly. So you need to choose 1 chromosome number 1, 1 from number 2, 1 from number 3, 1 from number 4. And I'm just circling these randomly, right? I don't know if there's a pattern. I don't know what's on these chromosomes, right? I don't know the information. I don't know where any mutations are. But you're going to give 1 of them, because you need to have a cell with 23 chromosomes. You need to have a gamete. That way you can mix your gametes with another individual's gametes to make your offspring. So again, this is the basis of genetics. We have to try to predict what's going to happen, even though it's random, but there are patterns that happen out of this, and there's probabilities, right? And the random random genes that the kid gets will determine all the traits that the kid has, right? So in a lot of ways, randomness is a big part of reproduction and passing information from generation to generation. So let's go back now to the twins. Is it possible that they could be this different? Can there be this much variation within a single family? And so one way that we learn about things is by making models. I know that we made some models, especially in the ecosystem unit last semester. If we were in class now, we would make a physical model to try to explain how this would work, but we'll just do it on the computer, of course. So here's in class, what I would have done is would have given you a bag with a bunch of little, what do you call them? Pipe cleaners of different colors. They would have been labeled like they are on the screen, right? And your job would to be we want to make two parents, two normal, healthy parents with a diploid number of 6. I don't want to use 46 chromosomes. That's way too much work, right? Can you imagine being in class having to move around 46 little pipe cleaners to try to figure out how everything's going? That's way too hard. So in science, a lot of times we'll simplify things to try to make it so that it's manageable. So here we're just going to assume that the adult of these species has only 6 total chromosomes, a diploid number of 6. So first we need to make the two parents, right? I have given enough pieces to represent two different parents. Your job would be to put those pieces and group them together, right? And so I'll give you a moment here as I'm talking to be looking at those pieces to think about how you would put them together. And of course, you could always pause if you need more time. But there's a lot of different ways you could do it, and you can't move them, and that's part of the difficulty of doing it on here. So let's just do it like this. Here are some options. These are the ways that students very often will arrange the chromosomes, right? So I have 4 different options. Which of the 4 is the best way to group the shapes so that we can show two parents with a diploid number of 6? All right, so again, I don't know exactly what you chose, but I'll go through the different answers now. 2 of these automatically can be gotten rid of. Hopefully you can see which ones those are because they violate one of the most important rules. A and D are breaking a very, very important rule, right? What's wrong with A and D? Well, A and D are incomplete. A is missing chromosome number 2 on that side, and chromosome number 1 on that side. Down here, this one's also missing chromosome number 2, and this one's missing chromosome number 3, right? So these parents would not be healthy, viable parents because they're literally missing entire chromosomes, right? And so those 2 cannot be the right answer. So let's get rid of them. Between C and B. Now, this is where you get into a little bit of interesting ideas about how models are made, because in the models, you can make the model represent what you want it to represent. So one thing that's different about these is the colors, and that's the big difference between these 2 options, right? For C, I grouped all the colors in the same boxes, right? All blue here and all green there. Meanwhile, over on B, there's blue and greens, right? Now, there might be reasons why you would think that you would mix them to have 2 different colors, but for our purposes here, I want to show 2 completely different parents, right? I want to make sure that when I look at these pieces, I know which ones are for dad and which ones are for mom. Although we don't have to say dad and mom. Which one is from parent 1 and which one is from parent 2? So in this case, C is going to be the best way to represent the 2 parents. Now, one other reason, besides just the idea that I want it to be easy to look at, I want it to be easy for me to see where the chromosomes came from, the blue parent or the green parent. But then there's also these letters, right? What do the letters represent? Those letters also show us that we don't really want to have the green ones and the blue ones mixed together, right? What do the different letters for each parent represent? Now, the letters for each parent represent where their chromosomes came from, right? If this is, say, dad, and this is mom, then A and B represent dad's parents, and C and D represents mom's parents. I guess I'm going with green being the mom. And again, I'm not trying to that's just, it's just normal that way to say it that way. But again, parent one and parent two, right? They came from different parents. So, like I said, 1A, 2A, and 3A would have come from dad's dad, and the B's came from dad's mom, and then C's and D's came from mom's dad and mom's mom. So this is where that idea of ancestors come in, right? And this is a weird idea, right? These parents are about to give their chromosomes to their kids, but the chromosome is actually grandpa's chromosome or grandma's chromosome, right? And then grandma got theirs from their parents, right? So in a way, we're just passing chromosomes down through the generations. And while your parents did give you your traits, those traits came from your ancestors, and your parents are kind of just like a placeholder. They're just a vehicle to transfer the chromosomes from the past into the present, right? And so that's one other reason why we wanted to keep the colors together. So in the end, are any of the chromosome number ones exactly the same? Even though they look the same, they're the same length. In real life, they're not different colors. Even though I made them the same colors, they cannot be exactly the same, right? If your chromosome number ones, if these are both exactly the same, then that means that parent is a clone, right? Because that means that parents were both exactly literally the same, right? Even though dad's dad has a chromosome 1, dad's dad is different than dad's mom, right? So the chromosome number 1 that mom gives, grandma would give, is going to be slightly different. There's going to be mutations in that chromosome that are not found in dad's chromosomes, right? So none of the chromosome number 1s are the same. None of the chromosome 2s or 3s or 4s that I didn't show all the way down to 23, right? They're not exactly the same, but they are homologous because they're still chromosome number 1s, and they still contain the same genes. Now that will make, maybe if that's a little confusing now, of course, we're going to keep going over some of these ideas as we learn more and more about genetics, and you'll see more and more examples that will help to explain the idea of homologous chromosomes that are kind of the same, but not exactly the same. So now we know something we need to know about dad and mom, right? We need to know about their chromosomes. It turns out that both of dad's parents, dad's dad and dad's mom, are Caucasian, right? Light-colored skin, light-colored hair, light-colored eyes. Oops, I didn't want that to show up right away, but I did. So here we go, right? So if we're looking down here, chromosome 1A, 2A, and 3A, those came from a Caucasian parent. 1B, 2B, and 3B came from a Caucasian parent. So dad doesn't have a whole lot of variation, at least on the surface level in his DNA, right? It's all basically light-colored features. Meanwhile, her mom comes from Jamaica. So let's make the C's be the chromosomes that mom got from her mom, right? That's the Jamaican genes. Meanwhile, her dad is Caucasian. So these chromosomes have the genes for light-colored features, right? So mom, in this case, does have more variation inside of her chromosomes, inside of her genome, than dad does. And so now we want to see if we take these two people and they were to pass half of their chromosomes, can you make the two different daughters, right? So now we would go back to our model. This is where in class you would have these pieces and I would have you move them around, physically move them, right? So we want to use the parent chromosomes to produce one of the daughters. So I'm just going to pick some of them semi-randomly, right? 3 came from dad, 3 came from mom. Now, I didn't choose them super randomly because I'm trying to make a point, right? I happen to choose all of the A's from dad and all the C's from mom, right? But in real life, it doesn't always happen that way. It could have been the A the first time, but then it could have been the B the second time, and it could have been the B the third time, or they could have all been the B's, right? There's a lot of combinations, and we'll talk about combinations very soon. But this is one of the daughters. And I think previously I made the C chromosomes from mom be the Jamaican chromosomes, the ones that have the instructions for dark features. So this would have been the daughter that is darker, with the dark hair and the dark eyes and the darker skin, right? But then we need to make the other daughter. Now, notice the chromosomes just came back to the parents, because in real life, the parents don't literally give all of their DNA, right? Like the parents aren't missing chromosomes when they have babies. You make lots of sperms and lots of egg cells. So this is just represents another egg or another sperm cell. And so we need to make the other daughter, but this time I made mom give the letter D chromosomes, the ones that came from the Caucasian parent. So those chromosomes would carry light colored genes. And then, of course, dad is going to give light colored genes. So you could still get one daughter who has very light colored features, right? And so here you have your two daughters, right? The family. By mixing the chromosomes randomly, you can make some children who are very light featured, other children who are dark featured, and then, of course, there are other, that's the mom right there. There are others that are kind of in between, right? Like they have some of the other children in the family have somewhat lighter features in certain parts. It just so happens that this girl got all of the light features and this girl got all of the dark features. Meanwhile, the other kids got some dark features and some light features. And we'll explain, of course, how that happens as we go along as well. But again, I want to remind you with the number one most important idea that comes from this video, that everybody has two of every chromosome, dads and moms. But when they're making the kid, you can only give half of your chromosomes. You have to give one of each pair, and it's all random. So what we end up seeing are a lot of different combinations, right, based on probability and randomness. And as we go forward, we're going to see more and more of these cases. These two parents are going to have kids. What might they look like based on all this randomness? Or again, we could look at other families and see some traits that offspring have and try to figure out where those traits came from. But every time we're going to do this, it comes down to this idea about the randomness of delivering half of your chromosomes to your children.